The wind howled across the empty land that night, carrying snowflakes that hit the small wooden cabin like tiny stones. Inside, Sarah sat near the dim fire, holding her baby close to her chest. The baby's cries filled the air, sharp and endless, echoing through the thin walls. Sarah tried to rock her gently, whispering soft words, her eyes filled with worry and tears. Her husband, Mark, sat at the edge of the bed, his hands buried in his hair. He looked tired and angry, his face pale in the firelight. "I can't take it anymore," he said suddenly, standing up. "She cries all night. You don't sleep. I can't work. We're falling apart." Sarah looked up, frightened. "She's just a baby, Mark. She's hungry, cold. Please, don't shout." Mark paced the floor, his boots hitting the wooden boards hard. "You don't understand. I'm tired of this life. No money, no food, no peace. I thought having a family would make me happy, but it's only made everything worse." Sarah's lips trembled. She stood up slowly, her baby still in her arms. "We can fix this. I'll find work. We'll manage somehow. Don't leave us, please." But Mark's eyes had gone cold. "I can't do this anymore," he said, grabbing his coat. "You'll find a way. You always do." And before Sarah could say another word, he opened the door and stepped out into the snowstorm. The cold wind rushed in, blowing out the weak flame of the lamp. The baby cried louder. Sarah fell to her knees, the baby's tiny face pressed against her chest as she whispered through her tears, "It's okay, my love. Mama's here. Mama won't leave." Days passed. The snow grew thicker. Mark didn't return. Sarah fed the baby with what little milk she could manage, but food was running out. Her hands were red and cracked from the cold. The cabin grew colder each night, and the baby's soft cries echoed in the darkness like a lonely song. Sarah walked to the nearby houses, knocking on doors, asking for help. Some gave her a loaf of bread, others just shook their heads. People talked behind closed curtains. "That's the woman whose husband ran off," they whispered. "She won't last long out there." She heard every word, but she kept going. Her baby needed her. She had no choice. By the fourth night, the firewood was gone. Sarah wrapped the baby in an old blanket and pressed her close to her body for warmth. She couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. Her mind was filled with fear and exhaustion. She decided to walk to town, though it was miles away. The next morning, the sky was white and heavy with snow. Sarah took a deep breath, tied her scarf tight, and began walking through the frozen path. Each step was hard. The baby was crying softly, and Sarah whispered, "Shh, it's okay, little one. We'll find help soon." After hours of walking, she saw the town ahead, a few wooden buildings, a church, and a general store. She pushed the door open, her face pale and covered in snow. The people inside turned to look. The room went quiet for a moment. Sarah walked slowly to the counter and asked in a weak voice, "Please, I need some milk for my baby." "I can work for it." The store owner, an older man with kind eyes, frowned. "Sarah, where's your husband?" She lowered her eyes. "He's gone," the people whispered again. "Poor thing," one woman said. "She's got no family here." Before Sarah could reply, her vision blurred. The world spun around her. She felt the floor move beneath her feet, and everything went dark. A strong pair of arms caught her before she hit the ground. Someone lifted her gently and said in a low, calm voice, "It's all right. I've got her." The voice belonged to Luke Walker, the quiet rancher who lived alone at the edge of town. He was known for being silent, for working from sunrise to sunset without asking for company. No one knew much about him except that he kept to himself. But when he saw Sarah collapse with her crying baby, something inside him moved. He saw not just a woman in trouble, but a memory. His own wife, who had once held a crying baby that never lived to see its first birthday. Luke looked at the store owner. "I'll take her," he said simply. "She won't make it through the night if she stays here." The man nodded. "You sure, Luke? You don't even know her." Luke glanced at Sarah, pale and trembling in his arms. "I know enough," he said softly. He carried her outside, wrapped her and the baby in a thick blanket from his wagon, and climbed onto the seat. The snow fell harder now, but Luke didn't stop. His horses knew the way home. The road was silent except for the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft sobs of the baby in her mother's arms. When they reached the ranch, Luke carried Sarah inside and laid her on the couch near the fireplace. He covered her with a quilt and poured water into a cup. He fed the fire until the room glowed with warmth. When Sarah woke, she saw a tall figure sitting nearby, staring into the fire. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the baby sleeping peacefully beside her, wrapped in a clean blanket. She turned her head and whispered, "Where am I?" Luke looked over, his deep voice gentle but firm. "You're safe. I'm Luke Walker. You fainted at the store. I brought you here." Sarah blinked, confused. "Why would you help me?" "You don't even know me." Luke poked the fire with an iron rod. No one should face a storm alone. Tears filled her eyes. "Thank you. I don't have anything to give you. Not even a home to return to." Luke shook his head. "Don't worry about that tonight. Rest. There's food on the table." Sarah tried to sit up, but her body was weak. Luke helped her drink a little soup, then stepped back quietly to give her space. She noticed his hands were rough and scarred, his face weathered but kind. He wasn't a man of many words, but there was something safe about his presence. That night, while Sarah fed the baby, Luke worked silently in the kitchen, chopping wood and boiling more water. The baby cried once and Luke froze for a second, his heart tightening with memories. Then he heard Sarah's soft humming, a lullaby, and the crying stopped. He turned slightly and saw her holding the baby near the firelight, her face glowing with warmth and love. Something changed in him that moment. For years he had lived in silence, surrounded only by the sound of wind and cattle. But now, for the first time, the sound of a baby's cry didn't hurt. It brought a strange kind of peace. Later, when Sarah fell asleep, Luke covered the baby's basket with a small quilt and looked out the window. The snow had stopped falling. The stars shone over the hills, bright and endless. He whispered to himself, "Maybe the Lord sent them here for a reason." The next morning, Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bread. Luke had already fed the animals and started a fire for her. He placed a small plate on the table and said, "You should eat. You'll need your strength." She smiled weakly. "You've done so much already. I don't know how to thank you." Luke looked away, a faint smile touching his lips. "You can stay here for now. There's work around the ranch. We'll figure things out later." Sarah nodded, her eyes welling with tears again. "You're very kind." He shrugged, still looking at the fire. "Just doing what's right." As the baby stirred in her arms, Sarah looked around the small but warm ranch house. The place smelled of hay and coffee, and sunlight streamed through the window. It wasn't much, but to her it felt like heaven after days of cold and hunger. And for the first time since her husband left, she felt safe. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep in her heart she knew this. The silent rancher who took them in had just given her and her baby a second chance at life. Days turned into weeks, and the snow began to melt slowly over the ranch. The land around Luke Walker's home came alive again with the sound of running water and the smell of fresh soil. Sarah had stayed longer than she expected. Every morning she helped Luke with small chores, feeding the chickens, mending clothes, and cooking warm meals. She was quiet and gentle, and she worked hard without complaint. Luke had not asked her to leave, not once. He didn't talk much, but he always made sure the fire was burning before dawn, and there was food for her and the baby. The little girl, Emily, had grown stronger. Her cheeks were rosy now, and she smiled whenever Luke walked into the room. It made something in him soften, something that had been closed for years. Sometimes in the evenings, Luke would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sky turn orange and gold. Sarah would join him with the baby in her arms. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them felt peaceful, not empty. Luke would hand her a cup of warm tea, and Sarah would whisper a soft thank you. That was their routine. The townsfolk began to notice. When Sarah went to buy flour or cloth, people would ask, "Still at Luke's place?" She would nod politely, not saying much. Some smiled kindly. Others whispered behind her back. But Sarah didn't care anymore. She had found safety, and that mattered more than gossip. One afternoon, while Sarah was hanging laundry, she saw Luke working with the horses. The way he moved, steady and patient, made her admire him quietly. He never raised his voice even when the animals were restless. He seemed to understand them in a way few men did. Emily was sitting on a blanket near the porch, playing with a small wooden horse Luke had carved for her. Sarah smiled and said, "She loves that toy. You made her very happy." Luke looked up from the stable, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Glad she likes it," he said simply. There was a short pause, and then Sarah added softly, "You're good with her. She laughs more when you're around." Luke's eyes lowered. "It's been a long time since there was laughter here," he said quietly. Sarah didn't ask what he meant, but later that night, when they sat by the fire, Luke finally spoke about his past. He told her about his wife, Mary, and their little boy who had both fallen ill one winter long ago. He had buried them under the oak tree near the hill and hadn't spoken much since. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone," he said. "Then you showed up that night holding that baby in the snow. I didn't know why, but I couldn't let you go." Sarah listened with tears in her eyes. "Maybe life brought us together for a reason," she whispered. From that night on, they shared more words than before. The loneliness that had once filled the house slowly faded. Luke began to smile again, even laugh a little when Emily tried to chase chickens around the yard. Sarah cooked meals that filled the house with warm smells, and she sang softly while she worked. When spring arrived fully, the ranch looked alive again. Flowers bloomed near the fence, calves were born, and birds sang early in the morning. Sarah learned how to milk cows and even tried riding one of Luke's horses, though she was nervous. Luke would walk beside her, his hand steadying the reins, saying, "You're doing just fine." One morning, a letter arrived for Sarah. The moment she saw the handwriting, her heart sank. It was from Mark. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter said he wanted a divorce. He had moved to another town and met someone else. He wrote that she could keep the child as if Emily were a thing to give away. Sarah sat on the porch silent for a long time. Luke found her there later, staring into the fields. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "He wants to end the marriage. He doesn't care about us anymore." Luke didn't say much. He just sat beside her and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Sometimes the people who leave make room for better things," he said softly. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wet. "You've already done more for us than anyone ever has. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," he said, looking out at the horizon. "Just keep living." That's enough. Months passed. Life became calm and steady again. The baby grew into a cheerful little girl who followed Luke everywhere. She would run to him when he came back from the fields, shouting his name in her tiny voice. Luke would lift her high in the air, making her laugh. Sarah would stand at the door, smiling through tears, realizing that Emily finally had the fatherly love she deserved. The townsfolk started to notice the change in Luke, too. He talked a bit more now, even shared a joke or two when he went to the store. One old man said to him, "Looks like that woman and her child brought the sun back into your life." Luke smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe they did." One evening after church, Luke walked beside Sarah as they made their way home. The baby was asleep in Sarah's arms, her small head resting on her mother's shoulder. The road was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the moon. Luke stopped near the fence where the wildflowers grew. He took off his hat and said, "Sarah, I'm not good with fancy words, and I don't have much to offer except this land and my heart. But I'd be proud if you'd let me give your girl my name and you my home." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were from happiness. "Luke," she whispered, unable to speak further. She nodded slowly, and a soft smile broke across her face. Luke placed his hat back on his head and gave a small, shy grin. Then it settled. The wedding was small but beautiful. It took place under the big cottonwood tree near the ranch. The townspeople came, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine joy. Sarah wore a simple white dress, and Emily held a little bouquet of wildflowers. When the preacher asked if Luke would take Sarah's hand in marriage, he looked into her eyes and said with quiet strength, "I will, for as long as the Lord allows me breath." Everyone clapped as they exchanged vows. Emily giggled when Luke lifted her into his arms after the ceremony, kissing her tiny forehead and whispering, "You're my girl now." That night, after everyone left, Sarah stood on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in gold and pink, and the land stretched wide and peaceful. Luke came up behind her and placed his arm around her shoulders. The baby was asleep inside, the fire crackling softly through the window. Sarah looked up at Luke and said quietly, "You saved us, you know. I don't think I'd be here if you hadn't stopped that day." Luke shook his head. "No, you saved me too. I just didn't know it then." The silence that followed was warm and full of peace. The sound of crickets filled the night. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed softly. The wind carried the scent of grass and wood smoke through the air. Sarah leaned her head against Luke's shoulder. "She stopped crying tonight," she said softly. Luke smiled. "That's because she knows she's home, and she was right." For the first time in a long time, all three of them had a home. Not just a place to sleep, but a place where hearts healed and love quietly grew. The ranch that had once been silent was now filled with laughter and light. The man who had lived in loneliness had found his family again, and the woman who had been left behind had found love where she least expected it. As the stars began to appear over the wide, endless sky, Sarah whispered a prayer of thanks. Life had taken everything from her once, but now it had given her more than she could ever ask for. A kind man, a safe home, and a love that would last through every storm to come. And in the stillness of that night, with the baby sleeping peacefully inside, the silent rancher looked at his family and felt something he hadn't felt in years: complete.